Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the annals of history. Whether you're winding down after a long day, seeking a soothing distraction, or drifting off to sleep, we're glad you've joined us. Before we begin our dive into the rough treatment of harlots in medieval times, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let us know how far across the globe our tales reach. And if you enjoy these quiet excursions into the past, consider subscribing for more calming tales. Tonight, we'll be exploring a somber and often overlooked corner of medieval life, the world of sex work. It's a topic that may seem heavy or unsavory, but there is much to learn from the lives of these women on the margins of society. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let us paint a picture of what it was like to be a harlot in the Middle Ages. The very words we use to describe sex workers, prostitute, harlot, strumpet, often carry a sharp sting of condemnation. But these terms have a long and tangled history. Prostitute comes from the Latin prostituere, which originally meant to expose publicly. It wasn't until the late 15th century that the word took on its current association with selling physical services. Similarly, whore has its roots in the Old English word hora, which could refer to a promiscuous woman or even an adulterer with no financial transaction involved. In medieval England, the most common term for a lady of the night was harlot, but even this word has shifted over time. It originally referred to a male beggar or vagabond in the 13th century, before becoming feminized and linked to unchaste behavior. Across the Channel in France, putain, derived from the Latin word for stinking, was a frequent insult hurled at sex workers. And high-class courtesans were often branded as cortigiana, an Italian word that also applied to ladies-in-waiting at royal courts, hinting at the blurred lines between formal and informal arrangements. The exchange of sexual favors for money or gifts was nothing new in medieval times. Prostitution had flourished in ancient Greece and Rome, where it was legal and even state-sanctioned in some cases. Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, established government-run brothels known as dicteria in the 6th century BC, staffed by slave women whose fees were fixed by the state. These were soon nicknamed Solon's girls. Later rulers, like Caligula and Nero, became infamous for their dalliances with prostitutes, even bringing them to official banquets. But as Christianity spread through the Roman Empire, attitudes began to change. The early church fathers railed against all forms of extramarital sex as sinful, with St. Augustine declaring prostitution a scourge that makes a brothel of the entire world. Yet pragmatists like Thomas Aquinas would later argue that prostitution was a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like rape and sodomy. Thus, harlots came to occupy a hazy middle ground in medieval society, officially condemned for their immorality, but also tolerated and even catered to. This was the world that medieval prostitutes had to navigate, a shadowy demimonde of desire and disgust, where carnal delights went hand in hand with social ostracism. In our next chapter, we'll take a closer look at the day-to-day lives of these women, from the rank and file of common brothel workers to elite courtesans moving in rarefied circles. We'll meet an aging madam in Southwark, London's notorious red light district, see how she runs her bustling establishment, and eavesdrop on the whispered conversations and clinking of coins behind its walls. The road ahead is not always pretty, but there is much to discover. And by shining a light on this hidden history, perhaps we can come to see medieval harlots not as faceless caricatures, but as women doing what they could to survive in a world that offered them precious few choices. So get comfy, dear listener, and let us unspool their stories together, one moonlit night at a time. We turn now to one of the most famous and influential courtesans of the medieval period, Tullia d'Aragona. Born in Rome around 1510, Tullia was the illegitimate daughter of a courtesan mother and Cardinal Luigi d'Aragona. From a young age, her striking beauty and keen intellect set her apart. She was educated in literature, music, and philosophy, rare attainments for a woman of that era, much less one born into the demi-monde of prostitution. As a teenager, Tullia began her career as a high-class courtesan in Rome, dazzling powerful clients with her looks, wit, and erudition. She commanded astronomical sums for her services and was soon a celebrated fixture in the city's intellectual salons and aristocratic circles. Unlike common sex workers toiling in seedy back alleys, Tullia and her fellow elite courtesans enjoyed lavish apartments, exquisite gowns, and the company of princes, prelates, and poets. But even for a woman of Tullia's charms and stature, the life of a courtesan was fraught with perils. She had to walk a tightrope always, maintaining the favor and largesse of her benefactors, while fending off the envy of rivals and the wrath of scorned wives. A courtesan needed shrewdness and cunning to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, where fortunes could shift on a whim. Tullia managed these challenges with aplomb, leveraging her talents and connections to build a glittering career that spanned decades. She moved between the great cultural capitals of Renaissance Italy, Rome, Venice, Ferrara, Siena, Florence. Famously, she debated the Florentine intellectual Benedetto Varchi on the nature of love, arguing passionately for a woman's right to romantic freedom and agency. In this way, Tullia d'Aragona was singular. Not content to merely trade on her physical allure, she fashioned herself into a paragon of Renaissance virtues, a true cortigiana onesta, or honest courtesan. She penned lofty Petrarchan verses, plumbed classical literature and philosophy, and dazzled with her erudite conversation. Her published works, including the 1547 poem Il Meschino and her 1552 treatise on the infinity of love, stood as proof of her formidable intellect. Of course, even Tullia could not entirely escape the strictures and prejudices of her time. In 1546, she ran afoul of the papal court's sumptuary laws, which dictated the attire of prostitutes. Cited for wearing verboten items like pearls and a veil in public, Tullia was forced to petition for a special dispensation on the grounds that she was a respectable woman who did not solicit on the streets. This incident underscores the precarious social position of even the most elite courtesans. They existed in a liminal space, straddling the realms of artistic muse and sexual commodity, accepted in the rarefied sphere of the intelligentsia, but still tainted by the inescapable stigma of their trade. For all her gifts and graces, Tullia d'Aragona could never quite shed the label of courtesan. Late in life, as her beauty waned and her clientele dried up, Tullia retired from the courtesan life and married, perhaps seeking some measure of respectability and stability. But she never stopped writing and creating, leaving behind a body of work that stands as a testament to her formidable mind and spirit. She died in 1556, having carved out an extraordinarily liberated and self-directed existence for a woman of her time and station. Today, Tullia d'Aragona endures as the archetype of the cultivated courtesan, an object of fascination and admiration. Her life story has inspired novels, plays, operas, and films, forever immortalizing her as a woman who subverted the cruel fates and prejudices foisted upon her, who grasped for beauty, freedom, and agency within the gilded cage of the courtesan's life. In many ways, she and her sisters in trade were the first modern feminists, carving out a space for female autonomy and self-determination in a deeply patriarchal age. As we've journeyed through the haunting, hidden history of medieval sex workers, we've witnessed the spectrum of their experiences, from nameless streetwalkers scratching out a meager subsistence in filthy alleyways to glittering courtesans enthralling kings and philosophers. We've seen how their lives were constricted and imperiled by the religious doctrines, legal prescriptions, and social stigmas of their time, subjected to punishments both petty and profound. But through it all, the harlots of history endured. They survived and even thrived in the face of unimaginable hardship. They found camaraderie and community with their fellow sex workers. They forged new identities and even fought for their rights in a fashion. In their struggles, they laid the earliest foundations for the modern movement for sex workers' dignity, safety, and self-determination. So let us honor the courage and fortitude of these long-ago sisters, the Jane Shaws and Eleanor Reicheners, the Angers Sorels and Tullius d'Aragona. Let us remember their names and say them with respect. And let us strive to extend to their modern descendants the compassion, humanity, and justice so long denied to their forebears. This is their story, brought in from the shadows at last. There may be no grander moral than this, that every human being, no matter their labor or lot in life, possesses an innate worth and dignity. In grappling with the hidden history of the medieval sex trade, we begin to see a way forward to a world free of the cruelties and depredations visited upon these women for centuries. A world where people are not reduced to what they do to survive, but what they dream, dare and build in spite of it all. And so we come to the end of our journey into the secret annals of the medieval prostitution. The street lamps are guttering out, the alleyways are still, and the night's final customers have slunk back to their lodgings. As a wan light seeps into the eastern sky and the church bells toll the dawn hour, the weary harlots wrap their shawls around their shoulders and turn toward home. They have survived another night, and they will rise to meet another day, for they are the unvanquished, the indomitable. They are the survivors of history. Part 4. Persecution and punishment of prostitutes. The life of a medieval prostitute was often nasty, brutish, and short. Not only did they face the daily hazards of disease, abuse, and unplanned pregnancies, but harlots were also frequent targets of persecution by both religious and secular authorities. From the pulpit to the town square, sex workers were denounced as sinful temptresses, corrupting society with their carnal wiles. One common punishment for prostitution in the Middle Ages was public humiliation. In 13th century France, women caught selling their bodies could be forced to wear distinctive striped hoods or have their hair shorn off. Repeat offenders might be marched naked through the streets, whipped, or even have their ears cut off as a visible mark of shame. These cruel spectacles served not only to discipline wayward women, but also as a stern warning to other would-be harlots. Imprisonment was another typical fate for medieval prostitutes who ran afoul of the law. In larger towns and cities, local governments began constructing special jails known as bridewell prisons to house disorderly women. Conditions inside were often overcrowded and squalid, with inmates subjected to beatings, hard labor, and meager rations. For pregnant prostitutes, the prisons could be a death sentence, with many perishing from complications of childbirth or seeing their newborns quickly succumb to disease. One fascinating case that illustrates the precarity of life as a medieval sex worker is that of Eleanor Reichener, a transgender prostitute arrested in London in 1395. According to court records, Eleanor was apprehended late one night while soliciting sex from a man near the Tower of London. Dressed in women's clothing, Eleanor had been working as a prostitute in brothels and private residences throughout England for years, offering a variety of sexual services to male clients. What's remarkable about Eleanor's story is not so much her arrest, but the matter-of-fact way her transgender identity was treated by the court. The documents describe her as John Reichener, who goes about as a woman, suggesting a degree of tolerance, or at least resignation, to gender non-conformity among medieval Londoners. Eleanor herself insisted to the court that she should be considered a woman because she did the work of a woman, i.e. sex work and housekeeping. Alas, the tale ends there, with no indication of what ultimately became of Eleanor Reichener. Like so many of history's marginalized figures, her fate is lost to time, but her arrest record provides a tantalizing glimpse into the complexities of gender identity in the medieval sex trade. Not all prostitutes were cis women, just as not all clients were men. The erotic appetites of the Middle Ages were as fluid and varied as our own. Another weapon frequently wielded against medieval harlots was the threat of expulsion from the city walls. To authorities and respectable burghers, prostitutes were a moral scourge to be cast out beyond the margins of civilized society. In some cases, brothels were quite literally pushed to the outskirts of town, relegated to near the gallows, leper colonies, and tanneries. The message was clear: sex workers were unwelcome interlopers, barely a rung above common criminals. But such expulsions rarely lasted long. For one thing, many medieval men, including priests and prominent citizens, still wanted access to prostitute services. There was also the perennial fear that, without an outlet for male lust, women and girls of good standing might find themselves the targets of harassment or assault. And so the bordellos always crept back, setting up shop in the shadowy streets and alleyway hovels of the town's underbelly. The cycle of condemnation and toleration would begin anew. For the medieval prostitute, it was a tightrope walk between survival and ruin. With the threat of prison, corporal punishment, and exile constantly hanging over their heads, these women navigated a dangerous world with few protections. The fact that any of them survived at all is a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable brutality and neglect. In many ways, their struggles echo those still faced by sex workers today, who continue to fight for dignity, safety, and equal treatment under the law. Part 5. Prostitution and the Medieval Church. When it came to the oldest profession, the medieval church found itself in a moral quandary. On the one hand, men of the cloth routinely railed against prostitution as an affront to God and a scourge upon the earth. Sex outside of marriage was a cardinal sin, threatening nothing less than the sanctity of the family, the social order, and the immortal soul. Lust was a deadly vice, and those who traded in it were seen as little better than the devil's foot soldiers. And yet, many medieval thinkers couldn't shake the notion that harlots might serve a useful purpose after all. As far back as the 5th century, the famed theologian St. Augustine acknowledged the necessity of prostitution as a kind of social safety valve. In his view, taking away brothels would be like removing the sewers from a palace. Sure, it might seem more pleasant in the short term, but soon the whole edifice would be overflowing with filth and disease. This idea of prostitution as a necessary evil gained currency throughout the Middle Ages. In the 13th century, no less a luminary than Thomas Aquinas was arguing that sex work, while morally dubious, nonetheless played a vital role in preserving chastity and social harmony. Without an outlet for male desire, Aquinas worried that men would run riot, forgetting their Christian duties and assaulting innocent virgins left and right. The church thus found itself reluctantly tolerating prostitution, with some local parishes even operating their own regulated brothels. If harlotry couldn't be eradicated, the logic went, it could at least be contained and monitored in a designated zone of sin. Some municipalities required prostitutes to wear certain clothing or badges, not unlike a medieval version of the red light district. Of course, this uneasy compromise didn't keep lusty clergymen from availing themselves of prostitute services. Records from medieval Paris show priests and monks were frequent customers in the city's brothels, despite the risk of excommunication if caught. Whether driven by hypocrisy or simple human frailty, men who preached chastity by day secretly enjoyed carnal delights by night. But the church also held out redemption for fallen women in the form of Mary Magdalene. One of Jesus' closest disciples, Mary Magdalene, was often depicted as a reformed prostitute in the Middle Ages, cementing her status as the patron saint of wayward women. Her story offered a powerful template. Even the most jaded harlot could be born again through contrition and devotion to Christ. Across medieval Europe, scores of Magdalene homes and asylums sprang up to redeem penitent prostitutes. These institutions provided food, shelter, and a chance at a new life for women seeking to leave the sex trade. But that redemption came at a price, namely, strict religious discipline and a kind of pious imprisonment that could last years. For most prostitutes, life remained a cycle of sin and fleeting absolution, played out in the shadow of the cross. The church might begrudgingly tolerate their existence, but it still viewed them as little more than necessary detritus to be hidden away. Even as it promised salvation in the next world, it heaped scorn and damnation upon them in this one. In a society so thoroughly saturated with religion, this ecclesiastical stigma only compounded the hardships of life as a medieval sex worker. Branded as fallen women and instruments of the devil, harlots were easy scapegoats for everything from plagues to barren wombs, even as their services remained in high demand. Perhaps most tragic of all, many likely internalized the church's teachings, viewing themselves through the lens of sin and self-loathing, even as they fought to survive another day. The road to redemption was narrow and steep. Part 6. The health risks of medieval sex work. In the Middle Ages, Paris was famed as a center of learning, commerce, and culture. But beneath the soaring spires of Notre Dame and the bustling market stalls lurked a darker underbelly, a shadowy realm of poverty, disease, and desperation that swallowed up the city's most vulnerable denizens. For the prostitutes who plied their trade in these mean streets, every day was a dance with death. One such unfortunate was a young woman named Joanna. Orphaned at a tender age, Joanna found herself alone and destitute on the Parisian streets. With no family to turn to and no respectable work to be found, she reluctantly sold her body to keep from starving. At just 14 years old, Joanna was already a veteran of the city's squalid brothels. Life as a medieval prostitute was a litany of dangers, chief among them the ever-present spectre of sexually transmitted diseases. Without reliable prophylactics or antibiotics, infections like syphilis, gonorrhea, and chlamydia ran rampant through the bordello quarters. And in a time of flawed medical understanding, these diseases were as mysterious as they were debilitating, a scourge blamed on everything from witchcraft to divine punishment. For a girl like Joanna, catching such an illness was practically an occupational hazard. With an endless parade of clients to service, prostitutes had little control over their exposure to STDs. Many suffered in silence, knowing a single telltale symptom could spell the end of their livelihood. To be marked as a pox-ridden woman was to invite ostracism, destitution, and worse. And so perhaps it was only a matter of time before young Joanna's luck ran out. One fateful night, after entertaining a wealthy but diseased client, she contracted the dreaded French disease, a virulent strain of syphilis that swept through Europe in the late 15th century. Within days, Joanna was bedridden with fever, racked by joint pain and disfiguring genital lesions. In her weakened state, Joanna likely turned to one of Paris's woefully inadequate hospitals. These medieval institutions were more akin to charnel houses than places of healing, stuffed to the rafters with the poor, sick, and dying. With little understanding of contagion or sanitation, patients were often crammed into communal beds, languishing in their own filth as they awaited the release of death. Tragically for Joanna, even this grim sanctuary would be denied to her. When the hospital nuns discovered her condition and her occupation, she was cast out onto the street like so much human refuse. In the eyes of medieval society, a syphilitic prostitute deserved no Christian charity or compassion. What became of Joanna after that is lost to history. Did she eke out a few more miserable years, scraping by on whatever paltry coins her disease-ravaged body could still earn? Or did she succumb swiftly to her illness, just one more anonymous casualty of Paris's merciless streets? For countless medieval harlots, this was the inescapable fate: to live hard, die young, and vanish without a trace. Joanna's story is a heartbreaking reminder of just how cruel the Middle Ages could be for those on society's margins. Prostitutes in particular faced not only the hazards of disease, but also the callous indifference of the very institutions meant to protect the sick and the poor. In a world without social safety nets or modern medicine, falling ill was often a death sentence for sex workers. Syphilis was just one of many scourges stalking Europe's red light districts. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, genital herpes, all spread unchecked through brothels and back alleys, laying low paupers and kings alike. Without effective treatments, these diseases wrought slow, agonizing declines marked by fever, sores, blindness, dementia, and even death. Even more horrific were the complications that could arise from pregnancy and childbirth. With no access to contraception, medieval prostitutes often found themselves in the family way, a dangerous state of affairs in an era of primitive obstetrics. Miscarriages and stillbirths were tragically common, as were life-threatening conditions like preeclampsia and postpartum infections. Those harlots who did manage to carry to term faced the heartbreaking prospect of abandoning their babies to foundling homes and church steps. With no means to support a child and no hope of escaping the sex trade, countless prostitutes made the agonizing choice to surrender their infants. In an age of sky-high mortality rates, many of these cast-off children perished soon after. For the truly desperate, the spectre of infanticide loomed. Although illegal and morally abhorrent, the practice of killing or fatally neglecting newborns was an open secret in medieval Europe's grittier quarters. It was a decision born of despair, made by women who saw no other way out of their hellish circumstances. This, then, was the bleak fate that awaited so many of the Middle Ages' degraded daughters. Condemned by accidents of birth to a life of sexual servitude, they faced each day knowing it could be their last. That disease, injury, or despair might finally claim them, as it had so many sisters before them. In this pitiless world, survival itself was a fragile miracle. In our last segment, we explored the harsh realities faced by common brothel workers in the Middle Ages. From sweltering, shared hovels to abuse, disease, and exploitation, these women eked out a meager living on the margins of society. But amidst the squalor of your average brothel, a lucky few harlots enjoyed a very different life of luxury and influence. These were the elite courtesans and royal mistresses who occupied a rare and precarious position at the highest echelons of medieval society. Perhaps the most renowned courtesan of 16th century Venice was Veronica Franco. Born in 1546 to a family of lower nobility, Franco was thrust into sex work at a young age by her impoverished mother, herself a courtesan. But Franco parlayed her wit, beauty, and intellect into a successful career, consorting with the wealthy and powerful men of Venice. From her lavish apartments, Franco entertained clients like King Henry III of France, who visited Venice in 1574. An accomplished poet, she engaged in lively discussions of art and literature with the leading minds of the day. Courtesans like Franco were expected to be charming, sophisticated companions as well as skilled lovers. Many became celebrities in their own right, the subject of gossip and adoration. But even for the most successful courtesans, their position was always tenuous. They existed to serve the whims and desires of powerful men who could cast them aside at any moment. Veronica Franco herself faced charges of witchcraft by the Inquisition, narrowly escaping execution. No one embodied the heights a royal mistress could reach and how far she could fall, quite like Agnès Sorel. Born around 1422 to a provincial French family, Sorel came to the court of King Charles VII as a lady-in-waiting. She soon caught the eye of the king and became his favorite, earning the official title of maîtresse en titre, the first in French history. Showered with jewels, land grants and castles, Sorel wielded significant political influence over the king. She even accompanied him on military campaigns, nearly dying in childbirth along the way. Many credit her with helping inspire Charles to take a more active role in governing and freeing France from English domination. But few could forgive the unprecedented power and riches bestowed on a royal mistress. Sorel faced open hostility from nobles and courtiers who resented her rapid rise. Vicious rumors dogged her, including that she employed witchcraft to seduce the king. And after Charles's death in 1461, she was swiftly expelled from court, stripped of lands and wealth by the new regime. Agnès Sorel would die just a few months later at age 40, likely from mercury poisoning. She left behind 4 daughters to an uncertain fate. While the king erected an opulent tomb celebrating his immortal beloved, Sorel's true legacy remains fraught, stained by misogynistic attacks on her character that persist to this day. Such was the double-edged sword of life as an elite medieval prostitute. You might taste the glittering heights of wealth, status, and fame, but it came at a cost. For even the most exalted courtesan or mistress could never fully escape the rigid patriarchal bonds and moral stigma of the oldest profession. These women navigated a treacherous tightrope, always one scandal or change in affections away from ruin. The same men who courted them assiduously would not hesitate to brand them as sluts and harlots when the winds shifted. It was a dazzling but unstable existence, forever vulnerable to the very sexual allure and feminine wiles that granted them a provisional seat amongst society's elite. In our next chapter, we'll explore what happened when even high-status sex workers fell afoul of medieval laws and religious strictures. The wheels of justice could be especially cruel and unforgiving to those deemed wayward women, no matter how exalted their clientele. Veronica Franco may have escaped the Inquisition, but many accused harlots were not so lucky, facing imprisonment, torture, and even death at the hands of rigidly moralistic authorities. Stay tuned as we delve further into the persecution and punishment visited upon medieval prostitutes. We left off discussing the precarious position and ultimate downfall of many high-class courtesans in medieval Europe. Even the most celebrated and influential of these women could quickly fall from grace as the political winds shifted and powerful men tired of their mistresses. Take, for example, the infamous Diane de Poitiers. Born into a noble French family in 1499, Diane was renowned for her beauty, wit, and athleticism. She caught the eye of a young Prince Henry, and upon his ascension to the throne as King Henry II in 1547, Diane became his official mistress. The king was so besotted that he gifted Diane the magnificent Château de Chenonceau and allowed her unprecedented political influence. Yet not everyone was pleased with a mistress wielding such power. Henry's wife, Catherine de' Medici, saw Diane as a threat and bitter rival. As long as Henry lived, Diane was untouchable. But when the king died in a jousting accident in 1559, everything changed. Within days, Diane was forced to hand over her chateau and treasures to Catherine. Stripped of wealth and status, she lived out her remaining years in obscurity. Such reversals of fortune were all too common for even the most celebrated courtesans. No matter how wealthy and influential they became, their position was always precarious and dependent on the affections and whims of men in power. At any moment, a younger rival, a jealous wife, or a cooling of passions could spell their downfall. Of course, high-class courtesans made up only a tiny fraction of sex workers in the Middle Ages. For the vast majority of prostitutes, life was far from glamorous. Most worked in squalid, dangerous conditions, enduring abuse, illness, and social stigma on a daily basis. And if the hazards of the job didn't end their lives prematurely, persecution from civil and religious authorities often did. In Part 4, we'll take a closer look at the brutal punishments meted out to prostitutes in the Middle Ages. From public floggings to expulsion from cities, harlots faced harsh consequences for plying their trade. Yet one defiant woman stood up to fight against this injustice. Bronisława Szymanska was born into a poor family in the 15th century Poland. With few options available to her, she turned to sex work to survive, working in the brothels of Krakow. Conditions were grim, with rampant abuse and exploitation by both clients and brothel owners. Bronisława dreamed of a better life for herself and her fellow prostitutes. In 1455, she did the unthinkable. She went to the city council and demanded reforms to Poland's prostitution laws. Bronisława was a gifted speaker, and her impassioned pleas swayed some councilmen. Over the fierce objections of brothel owners and many clergy, a series of decrees were issued. Harlots could keep a larger cut of their earnings. Abusive clients faced fines and jail time. And city officials were to inspect brothels regularly for mistreatment. It was a small step, but a remarkable victory at a time when prostitutes were seen as expendable and beneath concern. Bronisława herself did not get to benefit from the reforms for long. Just a year later, she was murdered by an angry client. Her defiance had made her a target, but she had struck an unprecedented blow for the rights and dignity of sex workers. 400 years before the more famous Margaret Sanger fought to legalize birth control, Bronisława was demanding protections for some of the most vulnerable and stigmatized women in society. While she paid with her life, her legacy would be an enduring inspiration. To this day, some Polish sex worker activists still gather at her old brothel to lay red roses in her memory. Of course, these small legal protections did not end the persecution of prostitutes. Harlots continued to face arrests, imprisonment, corporal punishment, and even executions throughout the medieval period and beyond. In our next section, we'll meet a woman subjected to the ultimate penalty for the crime of prostitution. In 1565, a Spanish sex worker named Mariana de Castro was arrested in the city of Seville. Her crime: allegedly bewitching men with love magic to lure them into vice. The charge of witchcraft was a convenient way for authorities to make an example of an infamous local harlot. Despite her pleas of innocence, Mariana was convicted and sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, she was paraded through the streets, enduring jeers from the crowd. At the city centre, she was tied to a stake atop a pile of dry wood. As the flames began to rise around her, Mariana lifted her head to the sky, reciting the Hail Mary prayer as the smoke poured from her mouth. Mariana's execution sent a clear message about the cruel consequences awaiting any woman who dared to defy sexual mores. Her story spread throughout Spain as a cautionary tale. As we'll see, religious condemnation of harlots often went hand in hand with tacit acceptance of prostitution as a social necessity. This contradiction would come to a head with the advent of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. In the next part, we'll examine how the medieval Catholic Church grappled with the moral dilemma of sex work and meet some of the pious women caught in the middle. The romanticized image of the alluring courtesan, draped in silks and dripping with jewels, is a far cry from the harsh reality most medieval sex workers faced. For the vast majority of harlots, life was a brutal, desperate struggle for survival in a society that simultaneously demanded their services and condemned their existence. As we've seen, the lucky few might attain wealth, status, and influence as an elite courtesan or mistress to the powerful. Women like Veronica Franco in 16th century Venice and Agnes Sorel in 15th century France enjoyed lavish gifts, political sway, and access to the highest echelons of society. But even for them, success was tenuous and fleeting. Courtesans had to carefully navigate the whims of entitled men, the machinations of rival mistresses, and the ever-present risk of being replaced by a younger beauty. One false step could send even the most celebrated courtesan tumbling from her pedestal back into destitution and disgrace. Such was the fate of Eleanor Reichner, a transgender English sex worker, often forgotten by history. Eleanor's sad tale comes to us from the records of their 1395 arrest in London. The court documents describe them soliciting sex from men in women's clothing and being caught in the act of sinful, carnal deeds against the order of nature. Medieval England had little mercy for those who defied its rigid gender and sexual norms. We don't know what ultimately became of this rare medieval trans prostitute, but a harsh sentence of imprisonment, corporal punishment, or expulsion likely awaited them. These were the common punishments inflicted on sex workers, who faced persecution from both church and state. Harlots were a visible target for authorities eager to make an example of sinfulness and vice. In some cities, prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive striped hoods or special badges marking their low status. They could be publicly whipped, dunked in water, or paraded through town on a humiliating cart ride. Repeat offenders sometimes had their ears cut off. Many medieval towns eventually banished all known sex workers, relegating them to the margins of society in disreputable suburbs or red light districts outside the city walls. But despite official condemnation, medieval prostitution had a complex relationship with the church. In a society that prized female chastity, yet denied most women real power and autonomy, many saw prostitution as a distasteful but necessary evil. The influential church fathers St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas both grudgingly argued that sex work helped to contain male lust and prevent the rape of respectable women. Some priests and clergymen, supposedly celibate themselves, secretly frequented brothels. A few harlots managed to win the church's respect through acts of profound penance and devotion. St. Mary of Egypt was said to be a prostitute in Alexandria who saw the error of her ways and retreated to the desert for decades of harsh asceticism. Mary Magdalene, the most famous redeemed woman of the Bible, inspired the ideal of the reformed harlot. But for every celebrated penitent, countless ordinary women remained trapped in the sex trade. Even when the church tried to help, its efforts could be clumsy and misguided. In some cities, church-sanctioned brothels were allowed on the one condition: all visiting men had to spend time praying afterwards. A few convents of converted prostitutes such as St. Mary Magdalene took in harlots who wished to reinvent themselves as nuns, but their admissions were selective and their resources strained. Most women had nowhere else to turn. This was especially true considering the immense health risks of the medieval sex trade. Syphilis spread like wildfire through brothels, leaving sufferers with weeping sores, blindness, dementia, and death. Gonorrhea, chlamydia, genital warts, and other infections were also rampant. In an age before germ theory, antibiotics, or reliable contraception, sex workers were uniquely vulnerable. Pregnancy was an occupational hazard, and some desperate harlots resorted to risky folk abortifacients, or even infanticide. In the 14th century Paris, a young prostitute known only as Joanna was publicly burned at the stake for allegedly spreading a venereal disease to her clients. Her awful fate speaks to the disposability of sex workers in medieval society. Powerful men might enjoy a harlot's company behind closed doors, but she'd be the first to suffer if calamity struck. Joanna's prospects were bleak from the start. Fatherless, impoverished, and lacking any support system, she likely turned to prostitution as a last resort. We'll never know the full tragedy of her short life and cruel death. She stands in for the many anonymous sex workers whose suffering is lost to history, Yet even in this grim context, a few extraordinary women managed to rise above their circumstances and shape the world around them. Veronica Franco is probably the most famous Venetian courtesan who ever lived. Born in 1546 to a family of nobles turned courtesans, Veronica followed in her mother's footsteps and took her first lover at the age of 18. A ravishing beauty with a keen intellect, she soon became the most celebrated cortegiana onesta, or honest courtesan, in the city. Her patrons included cardinals, princes, and even the King of France. But Veronica was no one's passive plaything. She wielded the weapons of wit, charm, and erudition to hold her own in a masculine domain. An accomplished poet, she published 2 volumes of refined Petrarchan verse and helped establish the literary salon as a key feature of civilized society. Her 1580s court case, in which she stood accused of witchcraft by a jilted lover, became a citywide scandal and a public referendum on female sexuality. Veronica defended herself so eloquently that she won not only acquittal, but public sympathy. She continued to entertain prestigious guests and admirers until her death, likely of syphilis, in her early 40s. Veronica's dramatic life story has inspired paintings, plays, novels, and an eponymous 1998 erotic drama starring Catherine McCormack. Today, she endures as both an evocative metaphor for Venice itself, seductive, cultured, and unfettered by conventional morality, and an intriguing proto-modern heroine who combines sexual allure with real personal and intellectual independence. She may seem exceptional, but she also gives us a glimpse of how some enterprising women made the best of a raw deal and worked the system to their own benefit and self-determination. At the other end of the social scale were women like Marion Lahome, an English peasant who lived a hand-to-mouth existence in the muddy streets and taverns of Colchester in the 1370s. Hauled repeatedly before the local court for drunkenness, theft, and of course harlotry, Marion endured a carousel of short jail stints while continuing to drink heavily and sell her body for a few pennies. Reading between the lines of the terse court rolls, we can recognize a woman trapped in a cycle of poverty, addiction, and exploitation, vilified and punished by the same society that produced her poverty and pain. For every glamorous Veronica Franco, 100 Marions suffered in squalid anonymity. Yet whether perched in a palace or lurking in an alleyway, all these women were simply trying to survive in a deeply patriarchal civilization with few options. As the centuries progress, we can trace a long road from medieval prostitution to the sex workers' rights movement of today. In the 1970s, French sex workers occupied churches to protest police harassment and unsafe working conditions, much like their medieval foremothers in sanctioned brothels. The famous red umbrella, a key symbol of the movement, has its roots in the red hand lanterns that once marked brothel quarters in medieval Venice and Amsterdam. Today, as the debate over decriminalizing sex work rages on, it's clear that the stigma and marginalization of the profession have deep historical roots. To chart a way forward, we must look back and recognize the humanity of the women who came before. By learning their stories, we restore a long-suppressed truth. There have always been those who bought and sold sex, and they deserve the same dignity, compassion, and rights as anyone else. There's nothing medieval about that radical notion. Caught in a cruel cycle of poverty and exploitation, medieval harlots lived short, brutal lives. Let's take a closer look at the health risks and hazards that plagued these women on a daily basis. In the cramped, filthy rooms of your average medieval brothel, disease festered and spread like wildfire. With so many men coming and going, buying a few minutes of escape and pleasure, it was almost impossible for prostitutes to avoid contracting syphilis, gonorrhea, or other painful sexually transmitted infections. The telltale sores, oozing discharge and rashes, must have been a constant source of agony. Yet the women had no choice but to keep working if they wanted to survive. You see, there was no penicillin or antibiotics in those days to quickly cure such ailments. At best, a harlot might seek out a local healer or wise woman who would apply poultices of herbs, honey, or even animal dung to try to soothe the inflammation. But more often than not, these treatments did little to alleviate the underlying illness, which would gradually eat away at her health. And what of those prostitutes who found themselves with child? With no reliable contraception available, unwanted pregnancy was an occupational hazard. Some women tried to induce miscarriage by drinking toxic herbal concoctions or thrusting sharp implements into the womb. Others would carry the baby to term, only to abandon it on the steps of a church or orphanage, praying some kind soul would take the child in. In the worst cases, prostitutes resorted to infanticide, strangling or smothering their newborns out of sheer desperation. Consider the tragic tale of Joanna, a young prostitute working in a 14th century Parisian brothel. One fateful night, Joanna welcomed into her bed a wealthy Italian merchant. But unbeknownst to her, the man was in the late stages of syphilis. Within days of their encounter, Joanna broke out in weeping, open sores across her body. In a panic, she continued servicing clients, hoping to earn enough money to pay for treatment. But all she ended up doing was spreading the dreaded disease even further. When the Parisian authorities learned of the outbreak, they decided to make an example out of poor Joanna. In front of a jeering crowd, she was dragged from the brothel and tied to a stake in the center of town. As the flames licked her feet, Joanna screamed in agony, her piteous wails echoing off the city walls. By the time the fire consumed her, she was already dead, her blackened corpse a warning to other harlots of the dangers of plying their trade. But what choice did these women really have? When the alternative was starving on the streets, a life of prostitution, with all its indignities and hazards, must have seemed the lesser of two evils. And so they soldiered on, painting their faces to hide the sores, downing cheap wine to numb the pain, all the while dreaming of a better life that would never come. As grim as Joanna's fate was, she was hardly alone in her suffering. Across Europe, thousands of prostitutes met similar ends. Ravaged by disease, driven to desperate acts, burned at the stake as scapegoats for wider societal ills. It's a dark chapter in history that's often glossed over in favor of more romanticized tales of courtly love and chivalry. But we owe it to these women to remember their stories, to acknowledge the incredible hardships they endured. In many ways, they were the ultimate underdogs, scorned by the pious, exploited by the powerful, afflicted by the perils of the oldest profession. Yet they endured, day after day, using their wit and wiles to scratch out a meager existence on the margins of society. So the next time you hear a bawdy joke about a medieval brothel or see a painting of a rosy-cheeked tavern wench, take a moment to reflect on the reality behind the caricature. These were real women, with real dreams and desires, who suffered greatly for the sin of being born poor and female in a cruel, uncaring world. The least we can do is bear witness to their struggle and honor their memory with empathy and respect. But the story of medieval prostitution isn't just one of unrelenting misery. Believe it or not, there were a few rare individuals who managed to rise above their circumstances and make a name for themselves in this most unlikely of professions. One such woman was Tullia d'Aragona, a renowned 16th century Italian courtesan and author. Born in Rome to a courtesan mother, Tullia seemed destined to follow in her footsteps. But from an early age, she displayed a keen intellect and a love of learning that set her apart from her peers. Under the tutelage of some of Italy's finest scholars, Tullia blossomed into a witty, erudite young woman, equally at home discussing poetry and philosophy, as she was entertaining clients in the bedchamber. As her reputation grew, Tullia began to move in elevated circles, counting noblemen, cardinals, and even the King of France among her admirers. but she was no mere plaything for powerful men. Tullia was a force to be reckoned with in her own right, using her charm and cunning to secure lucrative patronage deals and influence political decisions behind the scenes. Perhaps most remarkably, Tullia was a gifted writer, penning several well-received works of poetry and prose throughout her career. Her crowning achievement was Dialogue on the Infinity of Love, a daring treatise that argued for women's right to sexual autonomy and pleasure, ideas that were downright radical in her day. Of course, even a woman as brilliant and accomplished as Tullia couldn't escape the stigma of her profession entirely. She faced plenty of backlash from moralists and clerics who saw her as little more than a glorified whore. And like all courtesans, she must have grappled with the constant threat of disease, unwanted pregnancy, and the fickle whims of her wealthy clients. Still, there's something undeniably inspiring about Tullia's story. The way she defied societal expectations and forged her own unique path through life. In a time when most women had precious little control over their destinies, Tullia dared to dream of something more, and had the audacity to make those dreams a reality through her own wit and determination. You could argue that Tullia was an outlier, an exception that proves the grim rule of life for most medieval prostitutes. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But I prefer to see her as a beacon of hope, a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark and harrowing history. She reminds us that even in the bleakest of circumstances, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary resilience and ingenuity. So while we rightly mourn the countless nameless harlots who suffered in silence and obscurity, let us also celebrate the rare few who managed to rise above their station and make their mark on the world. Their stories may be the exception rather than the rule, but they're no less valuable for it, for they remind us of the incredible potential that lies within every human being, no matter how humble their beginnings. As we come to the end of our journey through the seedy underbelly of medieval Europe, what are we to make of this complex, often contradictory history? How do we reconcile the brutal reality of life for most prostitutes with the romanticized tales of high-class courtesans that have captured the popular imagination? Perhaps the answer lies in acknowledging that the truth, as usual, is somewhere in between. Yes, the vast majority of medieval harlots led short, miserable lives marked by poverty, violence, and disease. But that doesn't negate the fact that a select few, like Tullia d'Aragona or Veronica Franco, managed to carve out a measure of agency and autonomy within a system designed to exploit and degrade them. Nor should we forget the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the common brothel worker, who used every tool at her disposal, from crude folk remedies to carefully cultivated alliances with local officials, to survive in a world that seemed hell-bent on destroying her. These women may not have had the luxury of penning elegant treatises or schmoozing with royalty, but they were no less heroic for it. At the same time, we must be careful not to romanticize or sanitize the grim realities of medieval sex work. The fancy gowns and witty repartee of the elite courtesan were the exception, not the rule, and even they were forced to navigate a treacherous landscape of male desire and societal condemnation. The fact that a handful of women managed to thrive in such circumstances shouldn't blind us to the suffering of the vast majority who did not. Ultimately, the story of medieval prostitution is one of both extraordinary resilience and terrible oppression, of glimmers of hope amidst overwhelming despair. It's a messy, complicated history that defies easy moralizing or pat conclusions. But one thing is certain: these women, from the lowliest back alley prostitute to the most celebrated courtesan, deserve our respect and our remembrance. They were not faceless victims or passive objects of male desire, but complex human beings who fought tooth and nail for their survival and their dignity in a world that sought to deny them both. In honoring their struggles and their triumphs, we honor the struggles and triumphs of marginalized women throughout history, and recommit ourselves to the ongoing fight for a world where no woman has to sell her body to survive. It's a fight that began long before the medieval era and continues to this day, but one that we must never abandon, no matter how daunting the odds. So let us end our tale where we began, with a moment of quiet reflection for the forgotten harlots of history. May their memories be a blessing, and their stories a call to action for us all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the dark and complicated world of medieval prostitution. I hope you found it as illuminating as it was unsettling, and that it inspires you to look at history and the world around you with fresh eyes and an open heart. Good night and sweet dreams. Continuing the script from the previous section, Agnes Sorel's story illustrates the dizzying heights that a few lucky medieval courtesans were able to reach. But for the vast majority of prostitutes, life was a constant struggle against persecution, punishment, and the ever-present threat of violence. In the eyes of the law and society, sex workers were seen as immoral temptresses at best, and dangerous criminals at worst. Most medieval cities had harsh laws on the books against prostitution, and women caught selling their bodies could face brutal consequences. Imagine the scene. It's a chilly morning in late 14th century London. At one of the city's many local courts, a woman stands before the magistrate, her eyes downcast and her hands bound in front of her. She's been arrested for prostitution, and she knows all too well the punishment that likely awaits her. The magistrate regards her with a mixture of disgust and pity. He declares her guilty and sentences her to a public whipping to be carried out immediately in the town square. The woman trembles but remains silent as the bailiff drags her outside. A crowd has already gathered to watch the spectacle. The woman is tied to a wooden post, her back bared. She bites her lip to keep from crying out as the whip cracks across her skin again and again, leaving bloody welts in its wake. Some in the crowd jeer and hurl insults, while others turn away in horror or shame. Such scenes were all too common in medieval cities across Europe. Public floggings, time in the stocks, and even maiming and execution were all used to punish women caught engaging in sex work. In some cases, their heads were shaved to mark them as harlots. In others, they were paraded through the streets in disgrace before being run out of town. One of the most fascinating cases of medieval persecution of sex workers is that of Eleanor Reichner, a trans prostitute working in 14th century London. According to court records from 1395, Reichner was arrested for cross-dressing and sleeping with men, including several local priests. The transcript of Reichner's interrogation is a rare and incredible historical document. In it, she testifies to living and working as a woman named Eleanor for years, wearing dresses and makeup and taking on both male and female lovers. She even describes moving from town to town whenever suspicions about her true gender started to spread. Despite her defiant testimony, Reichner was ultimately convicted under England's strict anti-sodomy laws. We don't know for certain what became of her after the trial, but given the usual punishments meted out to cross-dressing prostitutes, it was likely a grim fate. Reichner's story highlights how medieval sex workers lived under multiple, overlapping forms of oppression. In addition to the stigma and danger of prostitution, those like Reichner who deviated from sexual and gender norms risked even harsher recriminations from the state and society. This multi-pronged persecution often culminated in campaigns to expel sex workers from medieval cities entirely. In 1161, King Henry II ordered all prostitutes to be rounded up and exiled from London. A century later, Louis IX banished all women of evil life from France. Other kingdoms and city-states imposed dress codes, geographic restrictions, and curfews on known harlots. The goal was usually less to eradicate prostitution completely, however, than to segregate it to the literal and figurative margins of respectable society. Many towns eventually established official red light districts on the outskirts where prostitution was tacitly tolerated. There, tucked away in dark alleys and cramped brothels, medieval sex workers endured a precarious existence defined by abuse, exploitation, and the looming threat of arrest and punishment. The law saw them as criminals to be confined and controlled, but offered precious little protection from the dangers and degradations of the trade. Though a handful of famed courtesans enjoyed lavish gifts and political sway, the reality for common prostitutes was near constant persecution. Whether chained up for a public whipping or driven out of town like a pariah, they lived at the mercy of a society all too eager to judge and punish them. While medieval harlots faced widespread ostracism and abuse from most corners of society, there was one institution that had an especially fraught relationship with prostitution: the Catholic Church. On the surface, the Church took a stern moral stance against sex work, condemning it as a sin and a threat to public morality. Yet behind this pious facade, the reality was much more complex and contradictory. Many prominent theologians, including St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, reluctantly condoned prostitution as a necessary evil. They argued it was better to allow men an outlet for their lustful urges, rather than risk them seducing respectable wives and daughters into adultery. This attitude led the Church to tolerate and even manage prostitution in certain contexts. Some medieval cities had bishop-licensed brothels, where sex workers operated under the supervision and protection of local clergy. The madams of these establishments were expected to swear an oath of loyalty to the Church and pay a cut of their earnings in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The Church also oversaw special hospices and convents that took in fallen women and worked to redeem them through prayer and penance. These institutions were seen as a vital bulwark against moral decay, as they removed temptations from the streets and restored harlots to the path of righteousness. Yet this charitable vision often clashed with the harsh reality within their walls. Many women committed to these institutions against their will, and some escaped only to return to sex work. Others endured prison-like conditions and abuse at the hands of their religious overseers. Even as the Church outwardly condemned prostitution, there is ample evidence that individual priests and even high-ranking clergy were frequent clients of sex workers. Court records and personal letters reveal instances of priests caught visiting brothels or keeping mistresses. Some used their moral authority to coerce or exploit vulnerable women into sexual relationships. This hypocrisy reached its apex in the pontificate of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. Before and during his papal reign in the late 15th century, Alexander was notorious for his libertinism and kept multiple mistresses. He even acknowledged fathering several children out of wedlock. The Church hierarchy's moral failings when it came to prostitution were thrown into especially sharp relief by the cult of Mary Magdalene, a reputed former prostitute who became one of Jesus' most devoted followers. Mary Magdalene was held up as the archetypal reformed harlot. Her story was used to justify the Church's charitable works aimed at getting sex workers off the streets and into the pews. Mary Magdalene's example offered the tantalizing promise of salvation and social rehabilitation for fallen women, at least in theory. In practice, the Church's programs for reforming prostitutes often did more harm than good. Many women cycled in and out of religious institutions, finding little support for rebuilding their lives outside the sex trade. Others found themselves trading one form of exploitation for another, as some unscrupulous priests used their authority to pressure harlots into sexual relationships. Though medieval sex workers might take some cold comfort in the knowledge that even princes of the Church sometimes shared their sins, they largely remained outcasts in the eyes of both religious and secular authorities. Neither the threat of damnation nor the promise of salvation could shield them from the very real dangers and degradations of the trade. Indeed, beyond the risk of arrest and persecution, perhaps the greatest threat facing medieval prostitutes was to their health and safety. In a time before antibiotics or reliable contraception, sex work in the Middle Ages was nothing short of a death sentence for many women. Syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval brothels, passing from client to prostitute to client in a vicious cycle. Without effective treatments, these diseases slowly ravaged their victims' bodies and minds, leading to disfigurement, madness, and agonizing death. One common treatment for syphilis in the Middle Ages involved slathering an infected prostitute's body with mercury ointment. This toxic cure often caused horrific side effects like tooth loss, internal bleeding, and neurological damage, but offered no real protection against the disease's progression. Pregnancy was another constant spectre hanging over medieval sex workers. With contraception largely unavailable or ineffective, many prostitutes found themselves with child after being raped by clients or even pimps. Some tried dangerous folk remedies to induce abortion, often with disastrous results. In one chilling historical account, a 14th century Parisian prostitute known only as Joanna faced charges of spreading a leprous malady to her clients. Whether this referred to syphilis or some other disease is unclear. What we do know is that as punishment for her crimes, Joanna was publicly tortured and burned alive. Joanna's grisly fate highlights the cruel indifference of medieval society toward the suffering of sex workers. Trapped in a dangerous trade with no legal protections and little access to medical care, harlots' lives were often nasty, brutish, and short. Many prostitutes met their end anonymously, succumbing to festering diseases or perishing in the squalid conditions of the brothels. Others died at the hands of violent clients or corrupt authorities. But whether by illness, injury, execution, or sheer despair, death was a constant companion for the medieval sex worker. Given the many cruel fates that befell medieval harlots, it's perhaps no wonder that even the more successful often came to tragic ends. The 16th century Venetian courtesan Veronica Franco, famed for her wit and erotic writings, saw many of her fellow courtesans poisoned, maimed, or driven to suicide by the rigors of the trade. Franco herself would die alone and in poverty, having lost her wealth and status in later years. For the vast majority who never achieved Franco's level of renown, a life of suffering and an early grave were all but assured. Yet even against such grim odds, some managed to rise above their station, at least for a time. One of the few medieval harlots to gain lasting fame and influence was Tullia d'Aragona, a 16th century Italian courtesan and author. Born in Rome to a courtesan mother, Tullia quickly gained renown among the Italian intelligentsia for her beauty, wit, and erudition. Mixing philosophy, poetry, and seduction, she charmed her way into the favor of dukes, cardinals, and even the King of France. Her salon in Venice became a renowned gathering place for artists and intellectuals, where Tullia presided as the star attraction. But even as she reached the pinnacle of courtly society, Tullia never forgot her roots in the demi-monde. She wrote eloquently about the plight of sex workers and the injustices they faced. In her most famous work, a philosophical dialogue called On the Infinity of Love, she boldly challenged the sexual double standards of her time. For a few glittering years, Tullia seemed to defy the usual script for women of her profession. But in the end, even she could not escape the stigma and instability of life as a sex worker. Beset by financial troubles and fading beauty, she died in relative obscurity, leaving behind a complex legacy. On the one hand, Tullia's story speaks to the transformative power of intellect and charisma to transcend even the direst circumstances. Her example gave hope to other ambitious courtesans dreaming of a grander existence. But Tullia was also the exception that proved the brutally unfair rule for most medieval harlots. Her singular rise only cast the grim reality facing her less fortunate sisters into harsher relief. As the sun set on the Middle Ages, the lot of the common prostitute remained as precarious and degrading as ever. Hounded by authorities, used and discarded by men, trapped in a dangerous trade with no real hope of escape. This was the bitter fate for the faceless thousands. Even as the world moved into the modern era, much of the medieval disregard and disdain for sex workers would remain stubbornly entrenched. Only in recent times have activists and advocates begun the long, difficult work of dismantling these attitudes and fighting for the rights and dignity of those in the sex trade. But the first step toward justice is acknowledging the humanity behind the often harrowing statistics. By confronting the real stories of medieval prostitutes, their hopes and dreams, their suffering and resilience, we begin to chip away at the misogynistic morality that has silenced them for so long. In honoring the struggles of our foremothers in the world's oldest profession, we also recognize how far we still have to go in building a society that protects the vulnerable and values all women as people, not property to be used or discarded at will. The road ahead is long, but the journey begins with hearing their voices echo across the centuries. As we close this dark chapter in harlot history, let us take a moment to remember the Joannas and Tullias, the Eleanors, and the many nameless others lost to time. May they rest in the peace and dignity denied to them in life, and may their memory fuel our resolve to fight for a world where no woman need suffer as they did. Agnès Sorel was the first woman in French history to be officially recognized as a royal mistress. Born into a family of minor nobility around 1422, Agnès caught the eye of King Charles VII while serving as a lady-in-waiting to his queen, Marie of Anjou. The king was instantly smitten by Agnès' renowned beauty, sparkling wit, and joie de vivre. Despite being over 20 years her senior and already married, Charles brazenly installed his new love in the royal palace, showering her with jewels, furs, and a staggering annual income of 4,000 livres. The besotted monarch even granted her the fiefdom of Beauté-sur-Marne, from which Agnès took her famous title, Dame de Beauté. Unlike many royal mistresses who operated behind the scenes, Agnès took a prominent place at court, often appearing beside the king at official functions to the chagrin of the queen and courtiers. Her extravagant fashion sense set new trends among aristocratic women who clamored to emulate Agnès' daringly low-cut gowns and towering headpieces. But Agnès was more than a pretty face in opulent attire. She exerted significant political influence over the king, acting as a trusted advisor and confidant. Her support for the French army during the 100 Years' War earned her the respect of many soldiers and commanders. Agnès reportedly even accompanied Charles on military campaigns, rallying the troops with her presence. However, her sway over the king and unconventional role stirred up resentment and rumors at court. Vengeful nobles spread salacious gossip, accusing Agnès of using witchcraft to bewitch Charles. The increasingly unpopular queen, Marie of Anjou, found herself eclipsed and humiliated by the royal mistress. Agnès bore 3 daughters to the king, though he stopped short of legitimizing them as he had done for a daughter born to another mistress. Fiercely loyal to Charles, Agnès never sought to advance her own family at court, focusing instead on supporting the monarch she loved. In 1450, while pregnant with her 4th child, Agnès fell ill with dysentery at the age of just 28. On her deathbed, she dictated a will, leaving most of her vast fortune to various charities and religious institutions, a final act of generosity that surprised her many detractors. Mere days later, on February 9th, the ravishing Dame de Beauté was dead. The king's grief was so profound that he ordered an elaborate funeral and had an effigy of Agnès placed atop her tombstone, an unheard of honor for a royal mistress. Although Charles would take subsequent mistresses, none would ever match the political clout, ostentatious glamour, or intimate bond he shared with Agnès Sorel. In many ways, Agnès was an outlier among medieval mistresses. Her overt political role, military adventures, and ostentatious public persona all upended societal expectations. She demonstrated that a royal mistress could be more than a mere sexual plaything, paving the way for other powerful maîtresses en titre like Madame de Pompadour centuries later. Yet despite her privileged position, Agnès was still ultimately beholden to the king's affections and whims. When Charles's son, the future Louis XI, finally persuaded his father to dismiss Agnès, she had little choice but to comply, retreating to her estates. For even the most influential of mistresses, power was ultimately temporary and contingent on a monarch's favor. Agnès Sorel's meteoric rise and sudden fall encapsulates the dizzying heights and lurking hazards that defined life as a medieval royal mistress. Her story has captured the imagination of historians and storytellers for centuries, immortalizing her as the prototype of a figure that would loom large over French history, the maîtresse en titre, or official chief mistress to the king. In the end, perhaps Agnès's most enduring legacy is the way she used her exceptional beauty, charisma, and intellect to forge an improbable path from minor noblewoman to royal counselor, challenging assumptions about the role an ambitious woman could play, even as a mistress, in the stultifying, male-dominated world of medieval politics. While later French kings' official mistresses like Diane de Poitiers and Madame de Montespan would wield even greater influence, Agnès Sorel set the mold, carving out a new form of feminine power in the royal court. Though long dead, the Dame de Beauté's legend lives on, an object of fascination, admiration, and even reproach. She reminds us of the complex, often contradictory expectations and limitations placed on women in the Middle Ages, where even the most exceptional female figures were still trapped within a social order that prized their beauty and sexual allure above all else. Agnès's story is one of breathtaking triumphs and poignant limitations, of audaciously breaking barriers and ultimately succumbing to them. In her short but extraordinary life, she lit up the medieval court like a dazzling comet, blazing a trail for generations of powerful royal mistresses to come, before burning out almost as quickly as she had burst onto the scene. The tale of the Dame de Beauté is in many ways the story of medieval womanhood writ large. At once grim and hopeful, subversive and circumscribed, a resounding declaration of agency that nonetheless could never fully escape the confines of a profoundly patriarchal age. As we remember Agnès Sorel, we pay tribute to all the complex, captivating women of the Middle Ages who, even in small ways, dared to upend convention and assert their right to desire, to influence, to be more than the rigid roles their society prescribed. Compared to the thousands of faceless, nameless sex workers who haunted the brothels and back alleys of medieval Europe, eking out a meager, miserable living on the margins, Agnès lived a rarefied existence of opulence, adoration, and access that most could only dream of. She inhabited a different world entirely from the syphilis-ridden child prostitutes, aging streetwalkers, and debt-bonded brothel girls who made up the vast majority of the Middle Ages' working women. And yet, there is a thread that connects even the most exalted courtesan and debased harlot of the medieval world. For no matter how high she climbed, a woman's worth was still ultimately tied to her sexual desirability, her ability to please and seduce powerful men. She may enjoy lavish gifts, political sway, and glittering renown, but it could all be snatched away in an instant if she displeased her patron or aged out of her allure. This fundamental precarity, born of a sexual double standard that prized women as objects of desire, but condemned them as immoral temptresses, bound all medieval women who sold or traded sex and intimacy, whether in a sumptuous palace bedchamber or a squalid back alley. It's what made even the most successful, celebrated courtesans like Agnès Sorel ultimately tragic figures, luminous comets destined to crash and burn under the impossible pressures placed on them. So, as we marvel at the meteoric rise and mourn the swift downfall of France's first official royal mistress, we must recognize both the individual audacity and brilliance of Agnès Sorel and the broader systemic injustices and inequities that circumscribed even her charmed life. The Dame de Beauté's story is at once an inspiring testament to female ingenuity and ambition, and a sobering reminder of the profound limitations and contradictions women of all classes faced in the Middle Ages. In pondering her remarkable, still resonant life, we confront the age-old question: how do you make a meaningful difference, forge an identity, exercise influence and agency in a world stacked overwhelmingly against you? It's a quandary that vexed medieval prostitutes and princesses alike, and one that women across the globe still grapple with today, albeit in very different contexts. Perhaps the enduring allure of Agnès Sorel's story is that it defies easy answers or pat conclusions. In many ways, hers is an ambiguous, bittersweet legacy, not the black and white morality tale so often imposed on sexual women, but something far more human, messy, and real. She was at once a hapless victim of her social order and an audacious rebel against it, an object of desire and an active, desiring subject in her own right. Agnès invites us to set aside our assumptions and knee-jerk judgments, and instead embrace the complexity, nuance, and fundamental humanity of even the most unorthodox or stigmatized female figures. She compels us to look beyond the simplistic archetypes of the virgin and the whore, the powerless waif and the conniving seductress, and recognize the manifold ways in which women, then and now, have doggedly carved out spaces for self-expression, self-determination, desire and agency within even the most repressive patriarchal constraints. As we continue to wrestle with thorny modern-day issues like sex work, female objectification, sexual double standards, and gendered power imbalances, Agnès Sorel serves as a poignant reminder that women's struggles for liberation, dignity, and autonomy are nothing new. They stretch back across centuries, surfacing even in the most unlikely of times and places. The Dame de Beauté's legacy, like that of so many complicated, convention-defying women of the Middle Ages, is a call to embrace that complexity, to resist facile stereotypes and snap judgments about women who trade sex and intimacy for survival or social advancement. It's a reminder that even the most marginalized, stigmatized women have always been full, complex human beings, with hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, triumphs and tragedies that resist easy labeling. So let us remember Agnès Sorel and all the medieval prostitutes, concubines, courtesans and mistresses she represents, with empathy, with nuance, with a keen understanding of the overwhelming odds stacked against them. Let us honor their struggles, their tenacity, their indomitable will to seize some small measure of power and pleasure for themselves in a world that sought to deny them at every turn. In studying their history, we chip away at the toxic, still enduring idea that a woman's moral character and social value can be neatly determined by her sexual behavior. We begin to untangle the toxic, contradictory expectations that have long ensnared women who dare to buck convention, leverage their desirability, or simply demand more from life than society deems they deserve. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us spare a thought for Agnès and the countless, long-forgotten sisters in suffering. The trafficked 10-year-old, the aging streetwalker, the penurious alehouse girl dreaming of a better life just out of reach. Let us hold space for their pain and their tenacity, their debasement and their defiant glimmers of self-determination. And in honoring their complex, deeply human stories, let us recommit to building a world in which no woman need be defined, constrained or demeaned by her sexuality. A world that affords every Agnès Sorel the dignity, equality, and boundless possibility she deserves, in all realms of life. A world that frees women to dream and strive and fail and love and lust on their own terms, beholden to no king or customer or crushing social code. This is the unfinished work that the Dame de Beauté and her fellow harlots and courtesans call us to, from across the yawning chasm of centuries. May we prove worthy of their struggles and their sacrifice, and may we finally bring to fruition the still unrealized ideal for which they strived. A world in which every woman, no matter her station or circumstance, can live freely, safely, and joyously as the mistress of her own radiant destiny. The brutal life of medieval harlots. Part 5. Prostitution and the medieval church. For much of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church held a constricted, yet conflicted view of prostitution. On one hand, influential theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas condemned selling sex as a grave sin that endangered the soul. They preached that lust was a destructive force that reduced humans to mere slaves of carnal passions. A truly virtuous Christian, they asserted, should resist the temptations of the flesh and strive to maintain a state of chastity. And yet, these same religious thinkers also grudgingly acknowledged prostitution as a necessary evil in medieval society. As Aquinas wrote in his monumental work, the Summa Theologica, prostitution in the towns is like the cesspool in the palace. Take away the cesspool, and the palace will become an unclean and evil-smelling place. In other words, they believed allowing brothels to operate could help contain male vice and prevent even worse sins like adultery, rape, and sodomy. This uneasy compromise between condemnation and pragmatic tolerance shaped much of the Church's official stance on prostitution. In the 13th century, Pope Innocent IV actually licensed brothels in Avignon, the seat of the papacy at the time, in an attempt to regulate the sex trade. Licensed sex workers were required to wear distinctive clothing and pay taxes to the Church. However, such efforts at legalization and control were often short-lived and inconsistently applied. More often, medieval church leaders railed against prostitution in fiery sermons, while turning a blind eye to its continued practice. Many priests and bishops, after all, secretly saw sex workers themselves. The hypocrisy was so widespread that in 1490, one Franciscan friar wrote, "Clerics, and priests in particular, flock to brothels, and sin with harlots more than laymen do." The Church also held up the figure of Mary Magdalene, the alleged reformed harlot and devoted follower of Jesus, as a model for fallen women to emulate. Preachers frequently invoked her story to encourage prostitutes to abandon their sinful ways and find redemption in religious life, as Magdalene supposedly did. Some former sex workers did find refuge in convents and monasteries, living out their days in quiet service and atonement. However, for the vast majority of medieval prostitutes, this ideal of spiritual deliverance remained a distant dream. Most lacked the resources or social support to leave the sex trade and face the constant realities of violence, exploitation, and dire poverty. The medieval church, while sporadically sympathetic, did far more to judge and punish sex workers than to meaningfully help them. Part 6. The health risks of medieval sex work. Beyond the moral perils so feared by the Church, prostitution in the Middle Ages carried severe, often deadly physical risks. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through brothels, turning them into vectors of infection for the wider populace. Syphilis, in particular, ravaged Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, earning the grim epithet, the Great Pox. At the time, medical knowledge was extremely limited, and there were no effective treatments for STDs. Syphilis could progress from painful sores and rashes to disfiguring ulcers, dementia, and organ failure. Other common conditions included gonorrhea, chlamydia, and genital herpes, all of which could lead to infertility, chronic pain, and death if left untreated. Sex workers, who often saw multiple clients a day in unsanitary conditions, were especially vulnerable to contracting and spreading these diseases. In an era without condoms or antibiotics, there was little they could do to protect themselves. The use of primitive contraceptives like sea sponges or animal membranes did little to prevent infection. Pregnancy was another ever-present danger for medieval prostitutes. With no reliable form of birth control, many sex workers endured multiple unwanted pregnancies over the course of their short lives. Some attempted risky herbal abortions or resorted to infanticide, abandoning or even killing their newborns to avoid the burden of raising a child alone in abject poverty. The story of Joanna, a 14th century Parisian prostitute, illustrates the deadly consequences that could befall women suspected of spreading disease. In 1307, Joanna was arrested and charged with infecting multiple men with what was likely syphilis. After a hasty trial, she was condemned to death by burning at the stake as an example to other poisonous harlots. Her tragic fate reflects the cruel scapegoating and criminalization that sex workers often suffered in times of epidemics. For countless women like Joanna, the health hazards of sex work were inextricably intertwined with the moral stigma and legal persecution they faced. With little public sympathy or recourse, medieval prostitutes suffered immense physical and psychological tolls, their bodies literally bearing the marks of social sin and disease. In this way, the sickness and pain endured by sex workers was not just a personal cross to bear, but a product of oppressive power structures that devalued their lives and well-being. Part 7. The legacy of medieval prostitution. The echoes of medieval harlots' struggles reverberate to the present day, shaping enduring attitudes and policies around sex work. Many of the same stigmas, legal restrictions, and dangers faced by women in centuries past still confront sex workers in the modern world. The rhetoric of religious conservatives who view prostitution as an affront to traditional values has its roots in medieval theology. At the same time, the radical notion that sex work is work and calls for decriminalization trace back to the few open-minded thinkers of the Middle Ages who argued for tolerance and empathy towards prostitutes. Just as it is now, the medieval sex trade was a deeply stratified world of haves and have-nots. For every glamorous, lavishly kept courtesan like Tullia d'Aragona, the 16th century Italian noble and published author, there were innumerable nameless streetwalkers living hand to mouth. D'Aragona, famed for her wit, beauty, and literary talent, entertained princes and poets in Renaissance salons. Her intellectual gifts and sexual empowerment earned her a place in the canon of women's history. However, her rarefied experience as an educated upper-class sex worker was worlds away from the exploited teenagers or destitute widows walking the wharves. The romanticized fantasy of the happy harlot, an enduring media archetype, must be measured against the far bleaker reality for the vast majority of women selling survival sex throughout history. These contrasting experiences speak to the continued need to recognize sex workers' diverse identities and material conditions. In the modern day, the movement for sex workers' labor rights and human rights seeks to secure protections like safer working conditions, access to healthcare, and freedom from police abuse and arrest. Just as their medieval forebears fought to survive in a world arrayed against them, today's prostitutes and adult entertainers are organizing to demand dignity, justice, and self-determination over their bodies and livelihoods. By honestly examining the difficult history of medieval prostitution, we can develop a more clear-eyed, nuanced understanding of the ongoing debates around commercial sex. Listening to the lost voices of women like Jane Shaw, Eleanor Reichner, and Joanna, and imagining how different their lives might have been in a society of greater compassion and equality, invites us to envision a better future for sex workers today. In honoring their struggles and sacrifices, we recognize their fundamental humanity and inherent worth beyond the circumstances of their occupation. Conclusion. From the filthy alleyways of London to the glittering parlours of Venice, the brutal life of a medieval harlot was one of constant peril and precarity. Subject to the cruel whims of pimps, clients, clerics and laws, sex workers faced violence, disease, persecution and scorn as a matter of course. Their backbreaking labour, so often dismissed as a necessary evil, propped up the very patriarchal institutions that condemned them as sinners and criminals. Though some, like Eleanor Rykener and Joanna, have been pulled from obscurity by historical records of their arrests and trials, the vast majority of medieval prostitutes died unmourned and unremembered. But by learning their stories and connecting them to the ongoing struggle for sex worker justice, we keep their memories alive and honour their indomitable resilience. The women who lit the brothel lamps each evening, who endured a magistrate's lash and a priest's rebuke, who soothed their bruises with a scrap of bread and a sip of ale, they left behind a legacy of survival in the face of staggering hardship. In death, they remind us of the grave costs of misogyny, religious hypocrisy, and the criminalization of poverty. So let us hold space for both the exalted courtesans and the lowliest streetwalkers of the Middle Ages, and for all the sex workers who came before and after them. May we recognize their full personhood and celebrate their triumphs and mourn their tragedies, and continue their fight for a world in which people of all genders and occupations can live and labor with respect, safety, and freedom. The story of the medieval sex trade is one of oppression and objectification, to be sure, but it is also an indelible tale of human endurance in the darkest of circumstances. By telling it, and by working to uplift sex workers today, we light a candle in the window of a hidden history and proclaim to all those who have been cast into the shadows, you are seen, you are valued, and you will not be forgotten. The life of a medieval harlot was a precarious one, filled with hardship, heartache, and all too often, an early death. From the common brothel worker to the rarefied courtesan, the business of selling one's body for survival remained a brutal reality for countless women. Take Joanna, a 14th century prostitute working in the squalid brothels of Paris. Like her fellow harlots, Joanna's days were an endless tide of grasping hands and grunting men, the air thick with the reek of sweat, sex, and desperation. With no access to reliable contraception, Joanna soon fell pregnant. But in a world with little sympathy for whores, an unwanted child was a liability she could ill afford. And so, like many in her trade, Joanna turned to the grim practice of infanticide, quietly smothering or abandoning her newborn babes. It was a sin that weighed heavy on her soul, even as the priests preached that her very existence was an affront to God. For what choice did she have? With no family, no husband, and no respectable means of support, the brothel was the only home Joanna knew. But even that meager existence was not to last. For in a time before antibiotics, syphilis and other poxes ran rampant through the brothels of Europe. With no real understanding of how such diseases spread, and even less idea of how to effectively treat them, infection was often a death sentence. Such was the fate of poor Joanna. As the telltale sores and rashes of syphilis ravaged her body, her clients dwindled and her earnings dried up. No longer a fresh-faced beauty, she was cast out of the brothel, left to wander the streets as a walking corpse. In the end, it was not the pox, but the torch of an angry mob that ended her short, unhappy life. Condemned as a vessel of pestilence, Joanna was burned alive for the imagined crime of spreading her disease. Hers is but one tale among countless others, a footnote in the untold history of medieval prostitution. For every celebrated courtesan like Veronica Franco, who entranced the elite with her wit and beauty, there were 100 Joannas, nameless, faceless, and forgotten. Even those who rose to the top of their profession, like Agnès Sorel, the first official mistress of a French king, were never entirely secure in their position. Lavished with jewels, gowns, and political influence, Sorel was the envy of the court. Yet she too met an untimely end, succumbing to mercury poisoning at the age of 28, likely from the very cosmetics and tonics she used to maintain her famous beauty. In death as in life, the harlot's fate was often cruel and ignominious. Denied a Christian burial, their bodies were tossed into unmarked graves or left to rot in paupers' fields beyond the city walls. In some cases, the church even sanctioned the use of their remains for medical dissection, a final violation in a life already steeped in indignity. Yet for all their suffering, it would be a mistake to paint medieval prostitutes as mere passive victims. Within the narrow confines of their world, many of these women showed remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and even solidarity. Take Eleanor Reichener, a trans sex worker arrested in London in 1395. In court records, Reichener's defiant testimony offers a rare glimpse into the life of a medieval prostitute on her own terms. Unapologetic about her trade, she regales the court with tales of pickups in churchyards and bawdy encounters with priests and friars. At a time when cross-dressing was a criminal offense, Reichner even brags of servicing clients while dressed as a woman, a bold declaration of agency in an age of rigid gender norms. Or consider the unnamed whores of Avignon, who in 1441 banded together to protest the church's attempt to expel them from the city centre. Marching through the streets with makeshift banners and throwing stones at church officials, these women mounted a fierce, albeit unsuccessful defence of their right to live and work within the city walls. Theirs was a sisterhood born of shared hardship, a glimmer of defiance in the face of a society all too eager to condemn them. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the medieval harlot, the simple fact of her existence, her refusal to be erased from history. In a world that sought to silence and shame them, these women scratched and clawed for their very survival, leaving behind a complex record of resilience, resistance, and above all, humanity. For all the romantic notions of the hooker with a heart of gold, the truth is that the vast majority of medieval prostitutes lived and died in obscurity, their passing unmarked and unmourned. They were the other against which proper society defined itself, the fallen woman held up as a cautionary tale to keep wayward daughters in line. Yet in their struggles, their small acts of rebellion, and even in their most desperate deeds, medieval harlots remind us of the indomitable will to live, to carve out some sliver of autonomy in a world aligned against them. Theirs was a sisterhood of the shadows, a quiet kinship forged in the darkest corners of history. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these forgotten women, for Jane and Joanna, for Eleanor and Agnes, and for the countless others whose names have been lost to time. In the grand tapestry of human history, their threads may be faint and frayed, but they are no less a part of the weave. May their stories endure, and may they rest, at long last, in power. As we've seen, the life of a medieval prostitute was fraught with danger, hardship, and scorn from a deeply hypocritical society. Even the most successful courtesans walked a tightrope between luxury and disgrace, never far from a precipitous fall. Take Tullio d'Aragona, renowned 16th century Italian courtesan, poet and philosopher. Born in Rome to a courtesan mother, Tullio's wit, beauty, and education granted her access to the most rarefied circles of Renaissance society. She counted dukes, cardinals, and celebrated artists like Girolamo Muzio among her lovers and patrons. At the height of her fame, Tullia's lavish apartments played host to salons where the greatest minds of the age engaged in elevated discourse. In a time when most women were denied a formal education, Tullia penned highly regarded poems and essays, even a work of philosophy entitled On the Infinity of Love. Her collection of sonnets exploring the complexities of love cemented her reputation as an accomplished woman of letters. Yet even Tullia could not escape the stigma and legal perils of her profession. In 1545, she faced charges in Florence for refusing to wear the yellow veil, marking her as a registered prostitute. Only intervention from her powerful Medici patrons saved her from imprisonment or worse. As her beauty faded with age, Tullia retired from court life and died in obscurity. For all her talents and glittering connections, this singular woman was ultimately still seen as little more than a concubine to be used and discarded. Her remarkable story epitomizes the fleeting glories and lurking hazards faced by even the most elite of sex workers. From streetwalkers in seedy alleyways to courtesans in silken finery, the medieval view of prostitutes as souls lost to sin and lust has cast a long shadow. Denounced by the pious, yet discreetly desired by men of all stations, branded as corrupt temptresses, yet exploited and abused, it's no wonder so many met tragic ends in gutters, jails, and asylums. But by peering back through time to recognize their suffering and basic humanity, we begin to challenge the tired tropes and stereotypes that still cling to sex workers today. These women were daughters, sisters, mothers, each with her own story of how she navigated an unforgiving world with the tools available to her. They don't deserve to be reduced to punchlines or cautionary tales. In our modern debates around decriminalization and destigmatizing consensual adult sex work, the lessons of history loom large. How much has truly changed since the days of Agnès Sorel or Jane Shaw or Mary Magdalene? Do we continue to punish and revile women for sins that require an equal partner? Can we find ways to protect and empower those who choose this path while still condemning exploitation and trafficking? These are complex questions with no easy answers. But one thing is clear: only by reckoning with the stark realities of the past can we hope to build a more just and compassionate future. The ghosts of history's disgraced harlots deserve nothing less. And so we lay to rest the hard lives and unsung stories of the Middle Ages harlots, courtesans, and streetwalkers. As you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for these largely forgotten women, the risks they faced, the indignities they endured, the fleeting moments of autonomy and pleasure they might have snatched between the hardships. May they trouble our dreams and prompt us to build a world where such suffering is no more. If you found this foray into the forgotten corners of history compelling, consider subscribing for more immersive tales to transport you on your journey to slumber. There are so many neglected narratives and fascinating figures waiting to be rediscovered together. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.